Chapter 7. The Silence Between Notes. The hum was the first thing, always the first thing. It lived in the walls of the cell, in the riveted metal seams and the cold floor plates, a low cycling drone that the unburdened called the silence. Myra had heard them name it with reverence in the corridors outside, the way people name something they worship but don't fully understand. To her, it sounded like a trapped insect trying to remember how to fly. She pressed her back against the wall and let it travel through her spine. That was the trick. Don't fight it. The silence was designed to disrupt memory, to soften the edges of recent thought until a person sat perfectly, stupidly still, their mind smoothed blank as polished glass. 2 days in here and she'd watched it work on the man in the adjacent cell, heard him go from packing and muttering to silence in about 6 hours. By morning, he'd been singing softly, a formless melody, nothing she recognized, nothing that belonged to anyone. Myra could feel the drone trying. It pushed at the edges of her, nudged at the warm interior where her memories lived. Jem's face, the specific way he laughed when he forgot to be careful, the smell of their shelter's cooking element burning off dust at dawn. The drone wanted all of it, wanted to thin it out like broth stretched with too much water. She hummed. Not the lullaby yet, just a low, plain tone pitched to sit just above the drone's frequency. She'd been doing it for hours in small bursts, feeling for the right angle, the way you'd run your fingers along a wall in the dark looking for a seam. Her throat was raw from stratospheric dust and dehydration. Didn't matter. She hummed until her skull vibrated and her back teeth ached. The cell was maybe 3 meters square. One door, sealed with a magnetic lock that communicated with the drone network. She'd heard the click-hand pulse sequence when they'd brought her in, the lock syncing with the ambient frequency, harmonizing into place. It was elegant in the way things designed by paranoid people are often elegant. The lock didn't just bolt. It listened, and it only released to a frequency it recognized, which meant the silence was also the key. She stopped humming. Let herself go still and just listen, pulling the drone's sound up through the floor and into her chest, feeling for its exact pitch the way she'd learned to feel for crystal resonance in the dark underbelly of Kalora, by letting the thing come to her instead of reaching for it. There. A frequency that split into two. A lower carrier wave and a thinner, higher overtone that cycled at a specific interval, roughly every 4 seconds. The lock listened for the overtone to confirm it was still synced. If the overtone broke or shifted or hit the lock in the wrong phase, she didn't know exactly what would happen. That was the dangerous part. That was where she stopped reasoning and started hopping. She closed her eyes. Jem needed stabilizers. She kept returning to that fact the way you press a bruise, not because it feels good, but because you need to know how bad it is. The memory bleed was accelerating. She'd seen his eyes when she'd left, unfocused, skipping, the way a scratched crystal skips when you turn it in the light, replaying pieces of things that weren't complete. Whatever illegal tech had been used on him in early childhood had left his recall fragmented, and the fragments were getting loose. Without a memory core stabilizer to anchor them, the pieces would keep drifting apart until there was nothing cohesive left to hold together. She needed to get to Holloway's black market stalls. Which meant she needed to get out of this cell. Which meant she needed to stop stalling and do the thing she was terrified to do. Myra filled her lungs. She started with the low carrier wave, matching it so precisely that for a moment she couldn't tell the difference between what she was making and what the walls were making. She felt it in the hollows of her cheeks, in the space behind her eyes. Then she slid the pitch, degree by degree, up toward the overtone's frequency, and when she found it, when the two tones clicked together inside her like a joint sliding into its socket, she felt the cell walls vibrate at a different rate. Felt it in the floor. Felt it in the door. She pushed. Not louder. That wasn't how resonance worked. She pushed the pitch into the lock's specific phase, slightly ahead of the drone's own cycle, so the two signals arrived at the lock out of sync. Like two people clapping and then one of them clapping early, throwing the rhythm apart. The lock gave a sound she'd never heard a lock make. A kind of stuttered clicking, confused and fast, and then a low, mournful tone that lasted less than a second, and then it simply stopped. The door swung inward 2 centimeters on its own weight. Myra exhaled. Her vision went gray at the edges from having held herself that rigid for that long, and she pressed both palms to the wall until the gray faded. Her throat felt scraped hollow. She crossed to the door and pulled it the rest of the way open with her fingers. The corridor was lit by thin bioluminescent strips along the floor, the same cold blue that the unburdened used everywhere, as though they wanted even their light to be stripped of warmth. 2 directions. Left was where they'd brought her in. She remembered the right-angle turn, the smell of something alkaline and sharp like cleaning compound. Right was where she'd heard movement, voices, the clank of meal distribution earlier. She went left. The alkaline smell hit her after a few meters, and she slowed, stepping carefully on the balls of her feet, keeping herself close to the wall. The corridor turned, and she turned with it, and at the far end a guard was slumped against the wall with his legs stretched across the floor and his chin dropped to his chest. His breathing was loud and regular. The silence turned inward. She stepped over his legs with extreme care, watching his face, and kept moving. There were 2 more locked doors between her and the surface access shaft, and she opened them both the same way, though it took longer each time because she was colder now, hungrier, her concentration fragmenting at the edges. By the second door, her humming had dropped a half step without her noticing, and she'd had to restart, pressing her forehead against the metal and breathing, just breathing, until she could find the tone again. The access shaft was vertical, maybe 15 meters up to the surface, with iron rungs bolted into the rock. Her arms were shaking by the time she pulled herself over the rim and collapsed onto her hands and knees on a surface of ridged stone, the pale daylight of Holloway's lower tier falling across her back in thin stripes through the overhead grating. She let herself have 30 seconds, counted them, then she stood. The shelter was a 40-minute walk through alleys that smelled of crystal dust and old rain, threading the narrow passages where Holloway's lowest tier pressed against the underside of Kaylora's docking struts. She knew the route. She'd mapped it in her first week on the floating chain, the way she mapped every route she used, out of habit and out of the understanding that routes changed. Islands shifted in the gravity tides, struts bent, passages silted up with shed crystal particulate that could be ankle-deep some mornings. Today the passage was clear. She pushed through the shelter's hanging curtain door and stopped. Jem was sitting in the corner where she'd left him. Knees to his chest, arms wrapped around them, head tilted at that specific angle she'd seen only once before, in a man 3 times his age who'd paid for too many crystal extractions and come out with nothing coherent left to say. His eyes were open. That was the worst part. They were open, and he was looking directly at the space in front of him where the cooking element sat, and his expression was neither distressed nor calm. It was absent. The way a room looks after every piece of furniture has been removed. The shape still there, the function gone.
Jem.
Nothing, not a flicker. She crossed the floor in 3 steps and knelt in front of him and put both hands on the sides of his face, tilting his head up so his eyes were pointing at hers. Still nothing. His skin was cool. His breathing was slow and regular, but he wasn't there. Whatever current ran through a person when they were present had gone very quiet, too quiet to feel.
Hey.
Her voice came out ragged, barely voice at all. She cleared her throat.
Jem. It's me.
She hummed the lullaby, not to resonate anything, not as a technique, just because it was the one thing she'd always used to reach him when the memory bleed got bad, when she'd find him mid-seizure and know the sound would thread through the static and land somewhere he could still hear. His breathing didn't change. She hummed louder, both hands still on his face, watching his eyes. Nothing. The lullaby died in her throat. She sat back on her heels and looked at him, at the empty open eyes, at the hands slack around his knees, and felt something move through her chest that wasn't quite panic and wasn't quite grief, but lived in the territory between the two, in that cold space where you understand what something means but your body hasn't decided how to respond yet. She stood. She needed stabilizers. Tonight. Not tomorrow, not in 2 days. The black market ran through Holloway's evening tier, 2 levels up, and she had 4 loose crystals in her jacket lining that she'd kept from the enforcers because they hadn't thought to check the seams. Enough to trade for something basic. Hopefully enough. She checked the crystals by feel. 2 dull and cool, 1 faintly warm, 1 nearly hot, all different, all tradable. At the curtain door she paused and looked back at her brother. He was exactly as she'd left him. The cooking element dark and cold beside him. The thin Holloway daylight stripping across the floor between them. She let the curtain fall. The shardsmith's stall occupied the dead end of an alley so narrow that Myra had to turn sideways to pass a man coming the other way. And even then his elbow caught her ribs and he didn't look back. The evening tier of Holloway was where all the things that didn't happen officially happened continuously. Trades, extractions, the kind of quiet consultations where no one used their real name. Bioluminescent lanterns hung in clusters from the overhead struts, their light a bruised amber rather than the unburdened cold blue, which meant the sellers here didn't want anyone to look too closely at what they were holding. Myra wanted to run. She made herself walk. The shardsmith went by the name Bale, which was probably not his name, and ran his stall from a converted cargo alcove with a half-door that he could shut at a moment's notice. The front was a shelf display of crystals in ascending color temperature, pale gray on the left, all the way to deep amber on the right. The warmest ones were behind a smudged pane of something that might have been glass or might have been compressed crystal resin. She could never tell. Bale himself was a lean man with hands that looked like they'd been constructed from rope, sitting on a low stool with his elbows on his knees, watching her approach with the patient, expressionless attention of a person who had watched everything at least once.
Stabilizers.
She said, no greeting. She didn't have time for greeting. Bale's eyes moved over her in that methodical way he had, cataloging damage, reading the story of the last 36 hours off her like a news feed. The raw throat. The shaking in her hands she hadn't been able to stop. The missing jacket seam she'd torn open to get the crystals out.
You look unburdened adjacent.
He said.
I look like I need stabilizers.
Both can be true.
He held out his palm.
Let's see what you've got.
She laid the 4 crystals across his hand one at a time. He turned them slowly under the lantern, running his thumb over their surfaces in that professional, emotionless way, reading temperature, without reacting to it. The practiced numbness of someone who'd made a life out of handling other people's most painful moments without letting them inside.
2 commons.
He said.
1 warm, recent. And this one.
He held up the 4th, the hottest one, between 2 fingers. Even from a meter away, Myra could see the faint amber pulse of it, a light that wasn't quite steady, cycling slowly like a held breath.
This one's special.
He said. His voice hadn't changed, but something behind his eyes had sharpened.
Don't read it.
Myra said.
I'm not reading it. I'm appraising it.
He set it down on the counter, with slightly more care than the others.
Special enough to buy you basic grade stabilizer cores. 1, maybe 2 vials if I'm generous.
I need 3.
You need to want things you can afford.
I need 3.
She said again, harder.
He's in catatonia. This isn't for trading up, Bale. This is for keeping my brother alive through the next 72 hours while I figure out where to get something stronger.
He looked at her for a moment that stretched. Then he turned, pulled open the drawer behind him, and began sorting through vials by touch. Myra became aware, in the way she always became aware of things that didn't fit, that there was someone else in the alley behind her. She'd heard footsteps stop. That was the detail. Not slow down, not turn, not shuffle into another stall. Stop. The specific stillness of a person making a decision about whether to proceed. She didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on Bale's hands and adjusted her weight slightly to the left, freeing her right side. One of the things the underbelly of Kaelora had taught her was that turning first gave too much away.
3 vials.
Bale said, setting them on the half-door with more weight than necessary. A decision made and announced through the sound of glass on wood.
4 crystals. The warm one covers the 3rd vial. We're even.
She reached for the vials, and the person behind her spoke.
He's overcharging you.
The voice was low, precise, the vowels too clean for Holloway, the voice of someone who had learned to talk carefully, who measured each word before releasing it the way you measured a chemical before adding it to a solution. Myra's hand closed around the vials. She turned. The woman standing at the alley's entrance was too obviously not from here. That was the first thing. Not in any dramatic way, nothing flamboyant, but in the way that a person who has spent their life moving carefully through clean, calibrated spaces simply cannot fully perform the easy looseness of someone who grew up in alleys. Her coat was good quality, dark, the kind of dark that didn't have dust on it, because someone had designed it to repel dust. She was older than Myra by maybe 20 years. Brown-gray hair pulled back with the efficiency of someone who had stopped thinking about hair as a feature. And her hands, which she was holding slightly out from her sides in the unconscious gesture of someone who wanted to look unthreatening, were the hands of someone who worked with very small things that required great care. Not a buyer, not a Holloway regular, not unburdened either. Wrong posture for that, wrong stillness. The unburdened had a practiced serenity to them. This woman was not serene. She was tightly wounded and trying not to show it.
He overcharges everyone.
Myra said.
That's not an observation. That's just how stalls work.
A memory core stabilizer, basic grade, is worth 1 cool crystal at fair rate.
The woman's gaze moved briefly to Bale, who had gone very still on his stool.
She gave you 4, including a warm one. You gave her 3 vials.
Markets fluctuate.
Bale said pleasantly.
Not that much.
The woman stepped into the alcove's amber light. Her eyes were on the crystals still sitting on the half-door, specifically on the hot amber one, which she looked at with an expression Myra couldn't immediately name. Not greed, something more like recognition, which made Myra take a step to the right, putting herself between the woman and the counter.
I didn't ask for an audit.
She said.
What do you want?
The woman's attention shifted from the crystal to Myra. Up close, she had very dark eyes that moved with the particular quality Myra associated with people who read things for a living, taking in a sentence and immediately connecting it to 3 other sentences somewhere else. She was reading Myra the way Bale read crystals, cataloging.
The same thing you're buying.
She said.
Stabilizers.
Bale's got plenty.
Myra didn't move. A beat passed.
You escaped from a silence cell.
The woman said, not a question.
Today, probably within the last 3 hours, your throat is abraded, the specific abrasion pattern that comes from sustained tonal production under stress, not from dust or illness. There's metal particulate on your knees, consistent with climbing iron rungs, and you're here instead of leaving Holloway entirely, which means whatever you needed to escape for is still here.
Myra stared at her.
Did you?
Myra said slowly.
Just diagnose me from looking at my knees?
I diagnose everything.
She said it without apology or pride, which was somehow more unsettling than either would have been.
It's a professional habit. I'm not a threat.
Everyone in Holloway says that.
Most of them are lying. I'm genuinely not sure what I am yet.
The woman glanced at Bale.
I'd like 2 vials of stabilizer, the same grade. I'll trade directly rather than through negotiation.
She set a crystal on the half-door beside Myra's remaining amber one. Myra saw Bale's eyebrows move. Barely, but they moved. She looked at the crystal the woman had placed down. It was cool-toned, pale, the kind of gray that wasn't quite gray but had depth to it, a blue beneath the surface that caught the lantern light and held it. Not a traumatic memory, then. Something old and precious, kept carefully, kept for a long time. Something the woman had decided to give up to get what she needed.
You're paying too much for 2 vials?
Myra said. The woman looked at her again. The recognition happening behind her eyes was visible, just barely, like something moving beneath ice.
Yes.
She said.
But it's what I have.
They stood in the amber light of Bale's stall while he packaged the vials and took his payment from both of them in the brisk. Eyes down way he used when he wanted to be invisible to whatever was happening between customers. He slid the woman's crystal into his appraisal drawer and kept the amber one toward the front, which told Myra everything about which one he thought would sell faster. Then they were both standing in the alley with their purchases, which meant the moment Myra had been calculating how to exit had arrived.
Whatever you're about to ask.
Myra said.
The answer is no.
I haven't asked anything.
You've been arranging yourself to ask something for the last 3 minutes.
Something shifted in the woman's expression. The faintest suggestion of surprise, carefully managed.
The stabilizers are for your brother.
She said. Myra's jaw tightened.
Don't.
I'm not trying to leverage you. I'm trying to...
A pause, and Myra had the sense the pause was genuine, that the woman was actually searching for the word.
Establish something. Common ground.
We don't have common ground. You're archipelago tier, I'm underbelly. I can tell from your coat and your voice and the way you hold your hands like you've never once worried about someone grabbing them. We are not the same kind of person.
No,
The woman said.
we're not.
She said it simply, without defensiveness, which Myra hadn't expected.
But I'm looking for someone too.
The alley hummed with Holloway's evening traffic, 2 tiers of voices and movement, and the distant clinking of crystal exchanges. Myra looked at this woman who was too careful and too clean, and too obviously frightened underneath the layer of careful and clean. And she looked at the vials in her own hand, and she thought about Jem sitting with his empty eyes pointed at the cold cooking element.
Who?
She said.
A child.
The woman's voice didn't change pitch, but something left it. A thin layer of something gone.
A girl. My daughter. She's been missing for 5 years, and I've recently found evidence that fragments of her memory signature are in Holloway.
She stopped, swallowed.
Specifically, she may be in the deepest vault of the Unburden's archive.
Myra was quiet for a moment.
Memory signature.
Her consciousness was fragmented during an accident. The fragments scatter and attach to loose crystal particulate. Some of that particulate surfaces in collection zones.
The woman's eyes moved to the amber crystal, still sitting in Bale's stall behind his glass.
You've held one.
Myra went very still.
The gold crystal.
The woman said.
You found it in the storm shed layer. You held it and saw a girl.
She stopped.
You didn't relive it. You never relive what you hold. You just see.
The silence between them lasted long enough for 2 people to walk past the alley's entrance without looking in.
How do you know that?
Myra said, and her voice had gone very quiet, the quietness of something kept hidden for a long time being required to come out into the open.
Because I've spent 5 years studying the pattern of my daughter's resonance across every crystal that surfaced in the recovery data. The gold one you collected 2 days ago, it was logged by an unburdened scanner before they confiscated your pack. The scan showed a non-reliving interaction.
The woman's eyes were steady, direct.
That's what you are, a resonant, and I think you already know how rare that makes you.
The amber lanterns swayed overhead in a faint pressure shift from the gravity tide, sending the shadows moving across the alley stones.
My name is Alira.
The woman said, and for a moment it was as though giving the name cost her something or gave her something. Hard to tell which.
Alira Voss.
I know that name.
Myra said slowly.
You invented the dual-axis crystal harvesting protocol. Your work is in the memo sign certification texts.
Yes.
You're not a buyer. You're a numenologist.
I used to think those were different things.
Alira's hands came together in front of her, fingers lacing and then separating. A tell. Someone who was used to holding things, now holding nothing.
I need to get into that vault. I can't do it alone. I don't know these passages. I don't know the resonance landscape of Holloway's lower infrastructure, and I don't speak in ways that will keep me alive down here long enough to try.
Myra studied her. The good coat. The abraded hands that were actually abraded in their own way, she could see now, in the specific faint burns of someone who handled memory crystals without protective buffers too often. Someone too close to what they worked on. Someone who'd made themselves part of the experiment.
The vaults are unburdened controlled.
Myra said.
I just escaped one of their cells.
I know.
They have a scanner. If they scan you, they'll read you in about 4 seconds. Your memories are dense. I can feel it from here.
She paused.
That's not an insult.
I know that too.
Alira's chin went up slightly.
I'm aware it's a significant risk.
Significant.
Myra repeated the word, turning it over like she was checking a crystal for cracks.
If I take you into the lower infrastructure, and you get scanned, and they get even a trace of what you know about harvesting protocols, they'll use it to build better extraction tools. Your knowledge alone is a liability.
Yes.
And you're asking me to go back into the place I just broke out of.
Not immediately, not without a plan.
Elira's voice had steadied, dropped to something low and direct.
But yes, I'm asking.
Myra looked at the vials in her hand, looked at the alley's far end, the direction of the shelter and Jem, and his empty eyes.
My brother needs something better than basic stabilizers. Within the week, or the fragmentation is going to pass the threshold where cores can even help him. I need a primary-grade resonance anchor, the kind you can't get from Bale.
A pause, then.
I can make one.
Myra looked at her.
I have the tools and the compounds at my lab on Calora, a primary grade anchor for a fragmented recall case.
Elira met her eyes.
It would take me half a day.
In exchange for helping you into the vault.
In exchange for trusting me enough to start.
Elira's voice had a slight catch to it, nearly nothing.
I know what I'm offering isn't the same as what I'm asking for. I know the vault is more dangerous and more uncertain than an anchor. I'm not pretending otherwise.
Myra thought about Jem, about the way he'd looked, the eyes with nothing behind them. She thought about the girl she'd seen in the gold crystal, laughing in a light she couldn't feel. A girl with no weight to her image, no emotional residue, just the shape of joy with all its warmth already drained out, sealed into something cold.
I'm not your tool.
She said.
No.
Elira said.
If we do this, you tell me everything, what's in the vault, what you know about the Unburden's archive systems, what you think is really happening to the crystals down there. All of it. Not what you decide I need to know. Everything.
Elira held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once without qualification.
And if at any point I decide the risk to Jem outweighs whatever you need from the vault, I stop. We stop. No arguments.
Agreed.
Then we start with the anchor.
Myra said. She didn't extend her hand. Neither did Elira. The agreement sat between them in the amber light, unceremonialized, which felt more real than a handshake would have.
Your lab on Calora, tomorrow morning.
Tonight would be better.
Myra almost said something sharp about that. Then she looked at the woman's face, at the tightness around her eyes that wasn't impatience, but was something much older and more exhausted than impatience. And she understood that Elira Voss had not slept properly in a very long time, and that tonight was better for reasons that had nothing to do with practicality.
Tonight.
Myra said. Elira's shoulders moved, the smallest possible drop, the body releasing something it had been holding so long it had forgotten it was holding it. They left the alley in the same direction, single file past the narrowest point, and Myra did not look back at Bale's stall or the amber crystal cooling behind its smudged pane. The gravity tide shifted faintly underfoot, the faintest roll like standing on a raft when a wave passes beneath it, and the bioluminescent lanterns swayed again, sending warm shadows long and slow along the stones ahead of them.